This is Ethan Skolnick, and welcome to the Five on the Floor podcast feed. Over the last few weeks and in the weeks to come, as we commemorate the 20th anniversary season of the Miami Heat's first championship, which came way back in 2006, you'll be hearing interviews that I conduct here on the feed, but also interviews that were conducted by Mateo Mayorga, part of the larger Five Reasons Sports Network NBA team. Already, he's done one with Eric Reed, the longtime play-by-play man of the Miami Heat, and now the longtime beat writer who's been covering the Miami Heat pretty much since the beginning and is still at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. That's Ira Winderman. He sat down with Mateo Mayorga for his recollections from the 2006 NBA championship. This episode, as many of the others, is sponsored by Prize Picks. Make sure you use that code 5, F-I-V-E. Get your $50 to play right away. And now, today's sit-down, Mateo Mayorga with Ira Winderman.
Mercy. Luxurious Heat Nation. Yeah. Mercy and Lago. Down to Biscayne. Yeah. Five on the floor. Ride for my dogs. Where here's the thing. You can check the score. Hustle hard, couple scars. Wearing bubble frogs. Down to Biscayne. Kept the floor playing, got it all banned. Y'all seen the block, stop with one hand. Impact we trust, it's power, have the guts. We're here to bring the heat, y'all can hang it up.
Welcome to Five on the Floor, a daily insider show on the Miami Heat and the NBA, featuring Ethan Skolnick, Greg Sylvander, Alex Toledo, Brady Hawk, and others from the Five Reasons Sports Network. Also, make sure to subscribe to Off the Floor for the most heat anywhere.
Welcome back to the 06 Files as part of Five Reasons Sports' continued coverage on the Miami Heat's 2006 season, their first championship, unbelievably now going on 20 years. Today, we are joined by one of the OGs of Miami sports media. He has been covering the team since 1988. He has seen the days of head coach Ron Rothstein when Jeff Van Gundy latched onto Alonzo Mourning's legs, some 3 titles, and now the start of a new era. I'm joined by the Sun-Sentinel's Ira Winderman. How are you, man? And thanks for coming.
Good to be here, and I guess always time for nostalgia as the years wind by.
Definitely. Ira, getting down to the nitty-gritty here, the season kind of started off a little bit of a roller coaster ride for the Miami Heat with their record, and also because Shaquille O'Neal sprained his right ankle. But had that not happened, had they started off well, what are the chances that Stan Van Gundy would have been the coach further on in the year or in June?
You know, I'm still not so sure because Shaq always had this thing about wanting the superstar coach, about, it takes a certain coach and a certain cachet to coach Shaquille O'Neal. And we've seen that throughout his years. And we saw that even after he left the Heat. So I think when the Heat set up this team, and we remember the years before. We remember the feisty teams of Caron Butler and the young players. That was a perfect Stan Van Gundy team. That was the perfect team for a young, new coach to step in. This was something completely different. This was not what Stan Van Gundy was hired for. Stan Van Gundy was hired for, wow, it's all gone to crap. You need to help bring it back together. And then all of a sudden, I remember Stan coaching in a summer league game and sitting in the stands with me, not knowing if the Shaquille O'Neal trade would happen. Boom, and then that happens, and the whole world changes. So I think at the end of the day, it takes a certain coach to get the best out of Shaquille O'Neal. Look, we saw it with the Lakers. We've seen it where he got over the hump. And to be honest, we've seen it in Orlando where he didn't get over the hump. And I'm not sure there's many superstars that have commented as publicly about their coaches as Shaquille O'Neal. So it had to be right coach for the right player. Doesn't mean Stan Van Gundy's not a great coach. It just meant for that team, for that player at that time, it was going to be more difficult.
When the move was made and Pat Riley replaced him as head coach, what did the players really think about Pat Riley?
Oh, there was some concern there about Pat and who he was and his rigidness and his structure. And here's what's crazy. When you think about that roster, in 05-06, and you think about those players, those weren't Pat Riley players. Those weren't exactly march through the wall, show up 2 hours before practice, stay 2 hours after. So this was a group that had been put together And even I don't think Shaquille O'Neal knew exactly what he got into. And I'm sure you'll talk about it over the years, that moment in practice with Shaq and Pat Riley and Alonzo Mourning having to step between them. So it really was interesting. When Pat Riley started coaching with the Lakers, he was a Showtime coach with a Showtime roster. When Pat Riley coached the New York Knicks, he was a slow time coach with a slow time roster. But here he didn't necessarily have Pat Riley players, but what he did have was players desperate for a championship, desperate to follow a leader, desperate to have someone out front with the resume. That's how it made it work with Pat Riley that season.
Sticking a little bit more with the beginning, how dedicated do you remember Shaquille O'Neal working to get back as soon as possible from this right ankle sprain?
This is an interesting point here because Shaq was at the point in his career when, honestly, even as good as he was that season and the years he challenged for MVP with Steve Nash, he also was in self-preservation mode. The one thing about Shaquille O'Neal is he loved money. And he knew the best way to continue to love money was having an enduring career. There's this old story. Karl Malone shows up in Utah. Adrian Dantley's his teammate. And Adrian Dantley famously tells him, never dive for a loose ball. The exact opposite you'd expect a veteran. Because Dantley's telling Malone, you get injured, you're not of use to me, you're not of use to your team, and mostly you're not of use to yourself.
Wow.
So Shaquille was always on the Shaquille O'Neal plan. He had been through the wars. He had been through the wars in Orlando. He had been through the wars with the Lakers. It sort of takes us, it's almost like fast forward 20 years. Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler knew what mattered. Shaquille O'Neal was maybe, I guess you could say, ahead of his time when it came to that. He was going to rehab and work at his own schedule. And he knew from the get-go, the schedule was the playoffs. That's where the money was made. That's where he could be his best. That's where there's no back-to-backs. So Shaquille O'Neal, sly like a fox. That's how I would phrase him in that era and really even beyond.
I see. Now, when this team would go on road trips, how would the team shake out in terms of groups?
Well, I mean, it was just clear. You had the veterans, you had the guys brought in, the desperate championship seekers. But it goes back to that story I just related about Shaquille O'Neal and being prepared and doing it. They were also guys who understood self-preservation. Now, you might say to yourself, wait a minute, Antoine Walker, self-preservation? Okay, there was the alcohol reeking and all that. We know the stories, being sent downstairs. I get all that. But there were also guys who knew the NBA life. And then there were the younger crews, the Dwayne Wade, the younger part of the roster, which was just, oh boy, let's do everything. Let's experience everything. So you sort of had that split to a degree, which was only natural. It was a good time to have that split for this reason. Dwayne Wade had yet to become the superstar. So Dwayne Wade never felt slighted. When Shaquille O'Neal took over the locker room, you remember, he gave Dwayne the nickname Flash. At some point, think about this, Mateo, and think about it in today's marketing. Ain't no player want to be given a nickname. He wants the nickname that he wants on his sneaker, on his marketing campaign. That shows how different an era it was. So the veterans were off on their own. The young kids followed, but the young kids also appreciated their place in that hierarchy. That's what made it work.
Towards the end of the regular season, they didn't end it off really well. They won six games and they lost 8. What would you attribute this poor play to?
I mean, the overall play and the improved play you're talking about at the end. I mean, is that where you're going with this?
Well, right before the playoffs, they didn't end the regular season well, is what I'm saying. And why would a team with so much high expectations not be so sharp at that point?
Go back and look at Shaquille O'Neal's comments about where his team's placed when they went to the NBA Finals. You probably remember this because even the year before, there wasn't this great record. And the year they won the championship we're talking about now, there wasn't a great record. But I just remember in his wonderful mumble, I've won in 6th, I've won from 5th, I've won from 4th. He would tell you where he won from. Again, they knew what mattered, they knew what didn't. And that's what was so interesting about the playoff run that would follow. When you think about those moments of truth, when you think about Dwayne and Gary Payton in the tunnel, when you think about what actually mattered, when Jay Will had to step up and be more than people thought he was, this was always about, let's get to the moment. You remember the disappointment the year before when they didn't get to the finals and how injury got in the way and they couldn't be the team they wanted. So it's just, to me, there are really like the timing of this series almost is a good parallel to what we saw with Jimmy Butler. Sometimes greatness finds a way, but finds it in its own way. That team knew that no one was going to remember the regular season. No one was going to remember the start of the playoffs. They were just going to remember whether Pat Riley's huge gamble the offseason before, when he rounded out the roster, whether that was going to work. So this was always about the playoffs. These were always about the matchups. I really think what resonated for that team, even though not all the players were there, was the way it ended the season before, when they were a pretty damn good team also.
You touched on this answer on the series with Chicago. In that one, the Heat won their first two, dropped the middle two, and then won the last two. You also mentioned the tense flare-up between Dwayne Wade and Gary Payton. Do you know what was said between them?
And here's the thing. Sometimes people think there's more than was said that wasn't said. It's how it's said. You don't tell Gary Payton what to do. He's Gary Payton. Think about Gary Payton going back even to when he made the finals with the Supersonics and playing for George Karl. He is an irascible son of a bitch. Because he is that, it makes him what he is. So Gary Payton, you don't have to say something. Gary Payton, you simply have to look at the wrong way. This was an interesting point for Gary Payton. He had banged his head against the wall with Sean Payton for decades almost. He needed to get over the hump. And he didn't want no young, snot-nosed kid, even though he'd wind up being a Hall of Fame guard, getting in his business at that time. It's as simple as that. Dwayne was always well-intentioned when he would say things, come on, we got to get more. We've got to give it more. But when you're a guy who's heard it all, and you see this young kid who you still didn't really know what he was going to be. He was the number 5 pick in that draft. He wasn't Carmelo. He wasn't LeBron. He wasn't Bosh. Yes, he had that great series and that great shot against New Orleans before he was growing as a player. He had his moments against the Pistons, but man, you don't F with Gary Payton. And that's what Gary was saying. And I think at the end, it's interesting how we can talk about that championship run, but you could see other things then how that carried over. Then when Dwayne felt disrespected, you remember the contract negotiations when they didn't bring him back. It's sort of the same kind of thing. Give me my respect. Every moment Gary Payton was there, it's give me my respect. So you wind up at that kind of moment, which is, the way it played out from there was very, very healthy for that team.
Comically about that situation, GP was asked in the locker room what it was, and he said it was like Donovan McNabb and T.O., and the reporter's follow-up was the question sounding very disturbed. But sticking with Dwayne Wade, how often would he hold players accountable on that team at that age?
See, I would say not much at all, but that's where the Pat Riley buffer was. Because at that point, Dwayne could sort of bounce off of Pat. Is this right? Should this be this way? And Pat by then was very good at dealing with veterans. You remember in New York when he suspended Anthony Mason, and then Mace showed up back in the building. They had their moments. Pat grew under that. He knew when to push and not to push. And he also appreciated Dwayne's the kid, Shaq's the superstar. I've got these other veterans in there. I've got to make it work. So I think he had Dwayne sort of pick and choose. But you know what? Dwayne, for what he is now, which is such a wonderful orator. I mean, the great job he did in the Olympics as a broadcaster, and now he's going to do in his second stage of a broadcaster. He wasn't that person then. He was very sort of pulled back. Remember, this was a player not many years removed from, was not even a starter in college, had to sit out a year, did not get many offers coming out of high school, even with what he did come, in Robbins. So a lot of it was Dwayne still growing into his moment. Dwayne's bravado on the court, I remember the Dallas series and everything there, was not the same way as Dwayne when he was around his teammates. He really understood how to deal. And, I got to tell you, that never changed. Even when he came back to the Heat, he would appreciate whether it's the Goran Dragic, or a player like that. He knew where to step in, and honestly, he knew where to step out. He was really smart that way. And you heard it at his Hall of Fame speech when he spoke about his father. He always had a genuine respect for authority. And I could see that. You could see back then, forget basketball for a second, you could see Dwayne was good people. And good people find a way to work with other people.
So the team Also beat New Jersey in 5 and then Detroit in 6 to get to the finals after the Chicago series. But before it started, what do you remember about how the public, speaking of fans and the media, were giving it or speaking of the Heat in terms of having a chance against the Mavericks?
It's not even the Maverick series because by then they had sort of coalesced a little bit more. But like you said, that was not a great season. This was not a dominant team. This was a team look, let's face it. After what they did the previous summer and they moved a franchise icon out to get Jay Will and to get Posey and to get Walker, there were real questions of think about each of those guys where they were in their career, and then think about Peyton joining them. I think it was late September. He was the last guy on the roster that they added then. So there were a lot of questions. Is like, by then those guys were sort of flotsam and jetsam. So I think going into the playoffs, there were not great expectations. There were thoughts, hey, this has its limits. Kobe got rid of Shaq because Kobe thought he could be better without him, right or wrong. That was the thought process. But by the time they got to Dallas, it was different because by the time they got to Dallas, they had gone through those battles. They had gone through those wars. So I think there was a much greater sense there of what was possible versus before the start of the playoffs.
The team, blew the first game against the Mavericks, got beat more decisively in the second game. But when they lost those two, were they doing heavy practice or more film work heading into game three?
That was still the time where there was heavy Pat Riley practice. We've heard over the years how it lessened to a little bit. But by that point in the season, Pat Riley had been through way too many of these. His last year, if you remember, in LA, were so dominant early in the playoffs. They went up for an extra camp in Santa Barbara. Remember, I think it was Byron Scott got hurt. I think it was a hamstring there. Lost to Detroit. It fell apart. From that moment, Pat Riley recognized that you can't in June do what you tried to do in November and December. So I think Pat was wiser and smarter. And also, I'm not so sure if you ever talked to some of those players that they were necessarily that willing to practice. I mean, think about you've been in the Heat locker room, you've been around them. I don't mean this at a school at a turn or anything, but these guys are chiseled these days. You never quite looked at Antoine Walker and had the word chisel there. You never looked at Jay Will as the ultimate buff kind of guy. So I think Pat Riley knew what he had. So yeah, meanest, hardest working, all the other crap they'll throw at you over the years. By that point in the playoffs, Pat Riley knew a team could be gassed, and he had gone through way too many playoff injuries with his players in LA and in New York. So I don't think they were necessarily overpushed to that point. I also don't think you could really overpush Antoine Walker.
Ira, in the next game, game three, the Heat looked like they were in control. They fell apart towards the end of the third quarter. Were really down 13 points going into like 6 minutes left. Dwayne Wade really saves their bacon. How much did he elevate his reputation with his performance that night, league wide?
When we think about it, it's interesting. A year ago, or just the start of last season, they put the statue in front of of Kaseya Center, and we say what you want about the statue, but if that was the quintessential Dwayne Wade moment, the huddle moment of we ain't going out, I'm not going out this way, of that moment, I think that's more of the quintessential Dwayne Wade moment because the game when they won and Dwayne got on in front of Mickey Arison was jumping up and down. Okay, that was just a game. This was the game that defined more than even that shot against New Orleans, the playoff legacy and the great. I think that huddle at that moment with that deficit and that comeback, no matter what Mark Cuban wants to think about the whistle in the series, I think that was the quintessential Dwayne Wade moment. And I can almost argue that him leaning forward in that huddle, that was the moment that Dwayne Wade truly became Dwayne Wade.
See, they blew out the Mavericks in the fourth game, tying the series. And this is where the Mavericks switched hotels. What do you remember around the whispers surrounding the Heat when that happened? Like, what did they think was going on? Or
Avery Johnson. Avery liked to talk. Avery was loquacious. Avery was a personality, still is today. I mean, he does some great work for CBS Sports and CBS Sports HQ, but I think Avery let Avery become a bigger part of the series than Avery Johnson should have been. It's interesting. You're talking to me about coaching, and you talked about Stan Van Gundy giving way to Pat Riley. I wonder to this day, when we remember down the road what Rick Carlisle did to the next iteration of Heat Finals teams, what if Dallas had a different coach? What if Dallas had someone better able to handle the moment? And God bless Avery Johnson for what he did and where he got his team. There's no question about that. But I think that's the moment that the Heat were worried about if Stan Van Gundy was in that position. If the
Right.
roles were reversed, would Stan been able to stand up to that moment? And I think honestly, when you look at the collapse of Dallas and when you look at what the Heat did there, I think a lot of it points back to Avery Johnson and just not understanding, hey, this happens. Leads are blown. You might have an owner bitching right and left about foul calls. Leave it outside the locker room. Let him handle this. You know, the worst thing you can do in sports is to show a sign of panic. For example, you asked me about Pat Riley overworking the players. If Pat Riley would have come out and said, "We just went through a 4-hour practice and I'm not putting up with this BS," I think that not only permeates your locker room, but the other guys see that weakness. It's like the lion in the wild, and they see the neck and they seize the moment. I think that's what happened there. I think that he realized, yeah, Mavs got pretty good players. They might be able to beat us. They showed that at the start. But we've got the slick back hair, and we've got a guy who delivered us to this moment, and they got a guy who's looking for a better rate on a two-bedroom suite. That's what I think.
In this series, the Mavericks were double teaming Shaquille O'Neal like it was still 2000 and 2001. And the moments where they left him in single coverage, he would turn around and hit a quick hook. In hindsight, was this the wrong strategy to deploy or using so much help on Shaquille O'Neal? Because Dwayne Wade got pretty loose in there.
He did, and Dwayne Wade got loose in attack mode. But of course, Mark Cuban to this day will tell you if there was a different whistle, it would
Yeah.
not have mattered. I mean, it's like the players now who are at the free throw line, and people will start counting, to say that they're too long at the line. It's almost like the Mavericks were counting and holding up in baseball those K signs for every strikeout every time that Dwayne Wade got to the free throw line. So again, the whistle in that series, let's be honest, had a lot to do with the outcome of the series. And it was a favorable whistle for Dwayne, or Dwayne, let's give him credit, created that favorable whistle. But Shaq was not the same player then. And you know what? It's really interesting, again, how we talk about one era and there's something else happening. So you talk about, okay, there were double teams there and they were troublesome. And then you go back to LeBron James in the next Heat iterations, can't post up JJ Barea. So sometimes you're right. It is those subtle nuances of double or not double, of stand your ground and fight the battle by yourself or not. And I think, again, coaching situation there. Look at that difference the next time the Heat faced the Mavericks in the NBA Finals when JJ Barea is guarding LeBron in the post, and LeBron, no offense, didn't know what the hell to do at the moment. Now, after the fact, he became the player that they needed in those situations. So, yeah, I think that was a coaching error because as much as Shaquille O'Neal was Shaquille O'Neal, Dwayne Wade by then had become Dwayne Wade.
You've been so great. I just got a couple more before I let you go here. But they got it done in the next game and in a close one. James Posey hit some big shots. Dwayne Wade was spectacular down the stretch. But what do you remember from the celebration before the plane ride to Miami and from the parade?
Well, look, I'm sure you've referenced in this series, the one shirt, one coat, one tie, which I do not believe. I do not believe that a fashion icon like Pat Riley, if he was forced to a game 7, would have been standing next to a salesman in Macy's going, "What do you got?" Yeah, I don't buy that. You can say that all you want, but he's Pat Riley. He's too meticulously playing. That's the arrogance of victory. But they did have a party scheduled. They didn't fly back right away. They went to a resort in Dallas. They celebrated. I remember in the locker room, in that arena, just so many players. I guess the word was vindication. Whether it was from Ron Rothstein in all those years, remember he was an assistant on that team, finally getting over the hump when he couldn't in Detroit. Jason Williams, I remember Jay Wills, him just sort of shouting, "They said I wasn't good enough. What are they saying now?" There were so many stories on that team. There was Gary Payton, like we mentioned, couldn't get over the hump with Seattle, just did it there. There were so many stories up and down that roster of guys who finally made it. So on one hand, and you know what? Let's not forget also Shaquille O'Neal winning without Kobe. How important that was. So I think it was, I would almost posit to argue there were more meaningful celebrations individually there than many future celebrations of what the Heat had done over the year or other teams. Because for so many players, there was something. For Dwayne, hey, We always go to the finals. I'm going to go to the finals again. I'm going to win some championships. But for so many others in the locker room, that was their moment. And it really tells you, because yes, James Posey went on and had success. But really, when you look at it, if we look through that entire roster, at least half that roster, and probably even more than that, that was their moment. That was the absolute high point of their career. In recent years, you have more repeat championships. After this year, we figure Shea Gilgeous-Alexander and that crew, they'll celebrate more. But that team in that moment, there were probably 5, 6, 7 guys in that locker room. That was it. That was the absolute peak of them showing what they can do, reaching that level. So yeah, it was really more emotional, and the emotion ran deep because hell, going to the next season, half the team suspended, just not the same players. Pat Riley sending players downstairs for conditioning. So yeah, it was a celebration that was heartfelt and heavily celebrated.
Right? You kind of heavily touched on it in this last answer, but why was it for these players by the end of the next season not being able to keep it going?
Oh, because you talk about a perfect storm. This was
Yeah.
not the big three built to not one, not two, not three, not four. From the get-go, when they made the trades the previous offseason, this was get us to this finish line. Pat Riley was exhausted of coaching. Hell, he had already retired once, as coach
Yeah.
of the Heat. You could just tell he just felt he had to do with this as a legacy moment. Antoine Walker, God bless him, but he found the perfect storm. Gary Payton was on his absolute last legs. And even James Posey, for what they needed for him versus, say, what the Celtics needed for him down the road, I think that was too much of an ask also. I think it was the ultimate ask and the ultimate answer from that team. You talk about a one-team wonder. And except for Dwayne Wade, when you look at the rest of that roster, that was, like I mentioned, just the high point for so many of them. So why did it careen? I mean, you remember opening night the following season. I mean, that was
Yeah.
horrific against
Yeah.
Chicago, and then Chicago did it again at the end of the season in that playoff series. No one expected it based on the regular season record of 2005, 2006. It was a fluke team, but it was the perfect storm team for that moment. Give Pat Riley, Andy Ellisberg the credit for getting those players knowing it would only work once. And you know what? It only worked once.
Ira, thank you so much. You've been such a superstar, and I was so thrilled listening to you, and I'm sure the audience will be as well, man. Thank you so much.
Still drunk with the memories, sort of like Antoine and Pose, but that's another story. My pleasure.
Thanks, Ira.